Good afternoon, everybody. Let's go back to last week's talk in this series. That mentioned examples of the presumed dead rising into unexpected life, some even from the coffin. So I offer this afternoon some continuity by relating how a big crowd saw the death and butchering of one man, and yet that man, that condemned character, has been resurrected and revived each November for over 400 years, only to be burned at the stake on a bonfire each year again and again. But he lives on in other guises. He has that marvelous ability to keep coming back from the dead and to live the Gunpowder Plot over and over again, and two unexpected legacies. Now, let's just start with this, what is called a traditional rhyme. Remember, remember the 5th of November. Gunpowder Treason and Plot. I see of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up the king and parliament. 70 barrels of powder below, poor old England to overthrow. By God's providence he was catched, and by God's mercy with a dark lantern and a burning match. Hello boys, let the bells ring. Hello boys, God save the king. And what should we do with Guy but burn him? So that's what the literature calls a traditional rhyme. And it's being said even these days in the 21st century as people set about burning representations of Guy Fawkes on a bonfire. Now, I hope this story of mine about one happenstance will illuminate how you guys and I are here today. We are here, whether we like it or not, as Virginians, inheriting an English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish past from Jamestown. We might, if Guy Fawkes had succeeded with the Gunpowder Plot, now be dealing with a history initiated as part of, say, a Spanish or a French colony. And that would have been through a terrorist plot in 1605. And if that terrorist plot had indeed succeeded 416 years ago, this area might well have fallen to be part of a Spanish-speaking colony ruled over by the Habsburgs, rather than by the Stuarts. Our use of the word terror comes from the so-called Reign of Terror in post-revolutionary France. Now, many died from the policies adopted by Robespierre and then the Directory over 11 months in 1793 and 1794. Nowadays, there are some nuances in the use of the word terror, and it seems usually to be applied to describe violence by the apparatus of the state inflicted on some of its own citizens, whereas terrorism is usually applied to violent actions aimed at destabilizing a state, a community or religion. Of course, terrorists can, to the supporters of their causes, be asserted to be freedom fighters or resistance fighters or jihadists for a religious movement. The conspirators behind the Gunpowder Plot were themselves defenders of what they saw as the Roman Catholic truth, backed by the primacy of the Pope. They were opposed to what they saw as the corrosive spread of heresy, and they felt betrayed by King James and by the popular defiance of the Pope. They hankered to go back to the state-prescribed Catholic Church of Queen Mary Stuart's 5-year reign between 1553 and 1558. Mary's reign saw 290 bishops, priests, and lay people burned at the stake for insisting on following so-called Protestant practices. Now, my daughter, in her research, suggests that an ancestor of the Pelling family called Richard Woodman, a farmer and ironmaster, was one of 17 selected from the male population of a small town in Sussex called Lewes to be burnt alive, presumably to deter others from heresy. They were executed on the orders of Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London in those days, later known as Bloody Bonner. Well, now it's over 400 years later, and Lewes is still marking the death of its 17 martyrs, each November the 5th, with processions and a big ritual bonfire topped by an effigy of Guy Fawkes. Now, after Queen Mary died, the Elizabeth ministers came to see English Catholics as a potential threat, supporting papal, Spanish and French ambitions for what we would call regime change in England. So increasingly, Catholics and their priests faced disdain, persecution, prison, and even execution during Elizabeth's time. Now, as the incoming successor to Elizabeth, James I paraded very slowly from Edinburgh to his new home in London. And he implied on the way that he would seek a more tolerant, even accepting attitude towards the still strong Catholic interest. He even stayed with some Catholic families on his way south. Particularly, James sought to placate the Habsburgs by the 1604 Treaty of London, made with the Spanish king, Philip III. So that was just a year after assuming the English throne. Now, we, from today's perspective, might find it difficult to appreciate just how dominating the religious practice was in the lives of those living under the Tudors and the early Stuarts. Those with any literacy would begin and end the day with Bible readings, and everyone in the village or town would be expected to attend one of the Reformed churches every Sunday. In the rural areas, this was just one way to reinforce the still existing feudal system. Only in the cities and the bigger towns was there much chance for non-conforming religious practices to get middle-class support. And there was always the threat of vindictive and violent opposition of church rituals and attendance in England, Wales, and Scotland. Well, in Wales and Ireland. In Scotland too, of course, there was the rigorous imposition of John Knox's non-conformist, called reformist, churching. In this context, an ardent Catholic, the charismatic Robert Catesby, of whom more anon, he'd been involved in a rebellion against Queen Elizabeth, but he lost patience with what he saw as the new king's inaction in meeting its promises to protect Catholic believers and their priests. So he consulted widely, and even in 64, asked the Pope what might be done. And so let's see a picture of that Pope. This is Pope Clement V, I think. Now, he urged that James be given time because he did know that he was trying to avoid clashes with the European Catholic powers. Now, what you have to recall was that Elizabeth had been excommunicated by Pope Pius V back in 1570. That to little effect, it should be said. And yes, James did want to reign over a peaceful, tolerant country. Yet trying to placate the religious centre, James found his regime was driven more and more into trying to silence the dissenters at both ends, both, shall we say, to the left, the budding Puritan movement, and at the other pole, devout Catholics. Frankly, James preferred a quiet life so that he could go out hunting without interruption. He resented carrying the concerns of the state onto the hunting field. But if you could get his interest, he did like a discussion about religious issues, hence the King James Bible. So let's go back and look at Catesby, if we could. Go back one, there's Catesby, and there's Robert Catesby again. He had, by April 1604, determined that violence was the best way to impose his righteous, spiritual, but really political ambitions on the English. His father had been imprisoned during Elizabeth's reign for being an open Catholic. Yet Cateby's wife attended a Protestant church. When both his father and his wife died, Catesby seemed to get a feeling of release to revive his militant Catholicism. He travelled to Spain to seek support, and if necessary, an invading force to reinforce his planned coup by English Catholics. But at this time, he couldn't get much support from Spanish officials. Returning to England, Catesby perceived that royal officials were increasing their hunting down of Catholic priests. He seemed to believe that overthrowing James, after all, James was an interloping Scot, he was sure that overthrowing James would be supported by the English populace. So he urged violence to overthrow James, and he also planned to kidnap James' younger daughter Elizabeth, then only aged 9, to set her up as a Stuart monarch, guided by a regency of Catholic bishops and nobles. He saw a grand violent act as the best means to prevent James from consolidating power to use against the Catholics and the papal cause. He knew that the king, his son Prince Henry, the nobles and peers, even some Catholics among them, the reformed bishops, the King's Council, foreign diplomats and members of the House of Commons, they would all be crowded together for the ritual opening of the Houses of Parliament. And so let's look at it, and that would be in the House of Lords, as it is even to these days, in the House of Lords. So let's look forward to a picture of the House of Lords for a previous opening of Parliament. There it is, that's the House of Lords for a previous opening of Parliament. And you can see it's a fairly crowded but quite small place. Now, a massive bomb placed there would obliterate all of the building. Catesby planned to remove and obliterate all the personnel and powers of the government by what was later called the Gunpowder Plot. Now, James I, as a new monarch, had hardly reached London in 1603 when a serious epidemic of illness and death became apparent, mainly at first in a village, Chiswick, 6 miles to the west of London. So one of James's first proclamations was to order infected properties to be closed for 6 weeks, clothing of the afflicted to be burnt, theatres and public gathering places to be closed, and collections made to support those in lockdown. Doesn't this sound rather familiar? There's a copy of that very executive order, which you can see in the museum at Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, this epic took 2 years to run its course. Again, something familiar to us today. But I guess the lacking a vaccine, the surviving Londoners got herd immunity. Historians estimate that a quarter of London's population died in the 1603-1605 plague. So that's some 50,000 deaths of the total population of 200,000 living in the city's formal boundaries. Just think of the despair and criticism of the new king's failure to cope. That must have given Catesby more certainty that James's overthrow would have popular support. Now, in Guy Fawkes, Catesby found a convinced supporter and co-conspirator. In May 1604, the original 5 conspirators met in a pub called the Duke and the Drake on the Strand. In June, one of them rented a house next to the House of Lords. Oddly, a property owned by the keeper of the King's Wardrobe, i.e. the King's tailor. By 1604, noises from next door revealed a coal merchant tenant clearing his stocks out from an undercroft, which coincidentally ran directly under the Lord's chamber. Of course, this property too proved to be owned by the keeper of the king's wardrobe. And he wanted to rent out the house, not understanding the potential role of the undercroft. Thomas Percy did the deal. The plot now seemed foolproof. Catesby purchased and barreled gunpowder in his home just across the Thames in Lambeth. In those days, gunpowder was a mixture of sulfur, carbon, usually charcoal, and potassium nitrate, that is saltpeter, and all readily available. Soon, 20 barrels of the powder had been brought in, and Fawkes, who was regarded as the reliable gunpowder technician, was to light one fuse, rush down the Thames, or be rushed down the Thames, and then spurted out back to France. But as the plague continued to rage, the opening of Parliament kept being postponed from the original February date again and again, till refixed for the fateful November the 5th, 1605. By November 1605, 36 barrels of gunpowder were piled up behind a forced lining of wood logs and domestic coal. However, the plot gradually added more adherents, and perhaps some were concerned that family and friends, even some Catholic-leaning nobles, would be killed along with the king, Prince Henry, and most of the governing classes. So on October the 26th, an unsigned letter reached a Lord Mount Eagle, urging him to stay away from the opening. That letter can still be seen in the National Archives in London. Oddly, the conspirators heard about this lapse of security. So Guy Fawkes checked on the 30th and found all the gunpowder was still in place. But King James was only briefed on the evening of the 4th. And very smartly, he at once ordered a search of all the palace of Westminster and many of its adjoining buildings. Guy Fawkes now was insisting he was just a servant called John Johnson. But he was found at midnight on the 4th, 5th. The store of gunpowder was at once associated with Fawkes, given the watch and matches in his possession. Guy Fawkes, Guido Fawkes, or John Johnson turned defiant, muttering, "My intention was to blow you Scottish beggars back to your native mountains." Sounds like the sentiments of today's Tory MPs dealing with the Scottish National Party. Guy Fawkes was dragged before the king. That is supposedly King James confronting Guy Fawkes. Now, the record suggests that the king was impressed by Fawkes as a brave soul. Well, he needed to be, because he was taken to the Tower, interrogated and tortured, until after 2 days he revealed the extent of the plot. Meanwhile, the other conspirators found they had little to no support. They were hunted down, some killed, others later, after speedy trials, were executed like common criminals. Many years ago, my wife and I had a personal tour of the Tower of London with our friend who was then the chief executive of the historic royal palaces. And we were shown the room where Guy Fawkes was held. And there on the wall was a framed document from 1605 with the signed decisions condemning Guy Fawkes to death, signed by the original judges. And on that tour, we were also shown a dismal, dank cell ready for Hitler if he had ever been captured. So Guy Fawkes was sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered. But on execution day in late January 1606, he either tripped or threw himself off the hangman's platform, and his neck was broken. So he died in front of the crowd before they dragged his tortured body back up onto the platform, and his tortured death was followed as his limp body was nevertheless quartered and the parts distributed around the kingdom and claimed to be a deterrent. But what if the gunpowder plot had succeeded as planned? 36 barrels might well have been exploded. And recently, a unit in the University of Wales with the great title, the Centre for Explosive Studies, laid out what the impact of the gunpowder plot of the plot might have been on the House of Lords and its surroundings. The conclusion was that all the parliamentary structures would have been burnt and collapsed, so burying and killing those attending the opening of Parliament. And also buildings up to half a kilometre away, say 550 yards, would have suffered such severe structural damage that, for example, even Westminster Abbey would effectively have been destroyed. Now, I did find an illustration of the blast zone laid over a 1600 map of Westminster, showing how the then clock tower and historic Westminster Hall would have been lost. Such a massive terrorist ambition. Here's that overlay, that red ring, shows you the extent of the blast. It would even go across the river into Lambeth. Now, let's go back and if we can pick up that picture of King James himself. There he is. That was in 1604, so that's a very contemporary picture. So he would have been killed, his son would have been killed, and many of the investors in the newfangled joint stock company, the Virginia Company of London, would have perished that November. 4 of the original promoters of what became Jamestown, Chief Justice Sir John Popham, the Earl of Southampton, Lord Arundel, Lord Delaware, and Sir George Somers would all have died. And amongst those dying would have been the King's First Minister, Robert Cecil, newly created Earl of Salisbury. That's Cecil. Now, we know that Cecil not only recruited some West Country friends to invest in the Virginia Company, he also put in £300 of his own money into the company that was going to try to set up a colony in what became Virginia. According to Google, £300 in 1600 values would today be the equivalent of some 92,000 US dollars. So probably the loss of leadership and the turmoil, if the plot had succeeded, would have left this part of our nearby coast for the Spanish to settle. Or perhaps the French may have come in from the west. So, no Jamestown, no Virginia, and then given the death of Prince Henry, no Henrico. Henrico was a so-called city founded and named in 1611 to curry favour with the then 16-year-old Prince Henry, of whom so much was expected. Sadly, he died at the age of only 18, leaving the succession in the inept and stubborn hands of his brother, later Charles I. Now, the what-ifs from histories of the gunpowder plot have occupied many historians, but I must move on only to note that James I left 2 legacies still evident today: the King James Bible and the continuing interest and fascination with Guy Fawkes. Our Guy has taken on a few lives of his own. For 415 years, his effigy has been burnt on communal bonfires, as it was here originally on this side of the Atlantic in the 13 colonies. But now, not only in the UK, he's also burnt in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Until the late 19th century, the bonfires were also anti-Catholic in tone, with the effigy of the Pope alongside burning with the Guy. As a teenager, I and others took a doll dressed as the Guy and pushed him up and down the high street in a cart shouting, "Penny for the Guy." And we collected a nice sum to buy fireworks for the 5th And we did burn the guy on the bonfire. For at least a couple of years, my father would construct a bonfire for us to have fireworks and to roast some potatoes in the fire. Now the parades and bonfires and the fireworks are carefully regulated, and in just a few well-organised places like Lewes in Sussex. That town burns the guy alongside a chosen contemporary figure. Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein have been recent choices, and Mrs. Thatcher was featured twice. This year, Boris Johnson is planned to suffer the ire of the bonfire alongside the guy. Lewis just loves the notoriety. But our Guy lives on in other ways. The comic book series V for Vendetta, beginning in 1982, and later the film of the same name, out in 2005, has an anti-establishment, anti-hero hidden behind a Guy Fawkes mask, like this one. And oddly enough, the one used in the film now is to be seen in a museum in Lyon, France. And the mask and its connotation caught on. Rioters in the Arab Spring wore the masks. Saudi Arabia's authorities banned the importation of Guy Fawkes masks, and later on the kingdom's religious police prohibited wearing the Guy Fawkes masks, as they asserted the masks were being used to incite youth to destabilize security and to spread chaos. And the wearing of any masks in the course of a riot is even now forbidden in Canada. And the legislators mentioned the threat behind Guy Fawkes masks in passing the legislation. The masks even appear today in street protests in Brazil and other Latin American countries. And the masks like this one were worn by young street protesters as a protective disguise in Hong Kong, as recorded in this Wall Street Journal photograph. Here, in this particular cutting, not only are they all wearing Guy Fawkes masks, but they also all are on their cell phones at the same time. Now, to top it all, some of those who charged into our Capitol building on January the 6th were sure enough wearing Guy Fawkes masks. Now, Time Warner, when the V for Vendetta film was released, was smart enough to copyright the mask design and says it sells 100,000 of these masks each Halloween. So good or bad, Guy Fawkes lives on with us on bonfire night, at Halloween, and often to exhibit a religious streak just by wearing his mask. But there is more. For Guy is with us in our everyday speech, though it is difficult to explain how or why. Guy Fawkes' first name has proved to be an easy adoptee in the English-speaking world. Some wonder how it is that thou, thee, thine, and thyself have passed into disuse, except in some Christian contexts. It seems in ordinary day usage in Tudor times, the term thou began to be used to talk down to somebody. And so it was best avoided. In his play Julius Caesar, Shakespeare uses thou to indicate talking down to a labouring class character. But the term you is applied to a higher class type. But the problem with you, of course, is that it appears both in the singular and the plural. So there was a problem in the plural. And as thou faded, for some no good reason or springboard that I can fathom, people began to use the term you guys as a substitute for the plural you or thou. Now, you guys first got recorded in a dictionary in 1886, but in the 20th century, you guys began to grow out of its masculine foundation to come to mean, and I quote Merriam-Webster, this is the definition, to refer or to address two or more people. These days, I hear you guys used in many different situations, Oddly, President Trump often referred to himself as this guy Trump. And when Emma, the British tennis sensation, won the US Open in September, she, in her second sentence of the initial TV interview as the champion and still on the court, thanked her parents, saying she was so grateful to you guys. It's so easy to bind a group together as you guys. Well, one often quoted alternative, of course, is yo or you all. But that term suggests a southern root or drawl, and maybe it's best avoided. So Guy Fawkes, despite being a notable failure, still lives with us today. First, in celebrating 416 years of the English-British state having some continuity. Secondly, in the 414 years of Virginia and Henrico surviving. Also, in having an ever-changing character that combines being both a ready villain and yet an much appreciated revolutionary social activist, safely hidden behind a mask. And he is so familiar that we all like to think, don't we? And how shall I put it? We all like to think that we are accepted as being one of the guys. We all want to be one of the guys, don't we? We just all want to be one of the guys. Thank you. So thank you very much, all you guys, for listening.
Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Mr. Tony Pelling for joining us and helping discover more about our world. I love this episode of history, and I very much appreciate you sharing it with us today. So please join us next week on Wednesday, November the 3rd at noon for Robots in Rehab. That's presented by Dr. Logan Trooping and Dr. Mary Bath. They're physical therapists at Sheltering Arms Institute. And this will be a talk about an exoskeleton that they use to help people recover from injuries. So you're not going to want to miss that one. That's an incredible piece of technology they're going to be talking about. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you all again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you all for being here today.